And a very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Issues and Attitudes. My name is Jeff Owens, Interim General Manager at WEIU TV and Radio. And my guest today is Mr. Charlie Titus. He is the author of Exploring the Land of Lincoln, also Professor Emeritus here at EIU in the History Department. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me on, Jeff.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you coming in on this Monday. The book is Exploring the Land of Lincoln, the Essential Guide of Illinois Historical Sites. We're going to talk about that for the next half hour. So when did you start the process of writing this book?
Well, I'm almost embarrassed to talk about that because I started a long time ago. I had taught in Maryland, decades ago, and I had done a small book on Maryland historic sites. And then when I moved back to Illinois, I thought, gosh, I'd like to do something like that here. And so I started messing around with it a little bit and doing this and doing that. But then, like with everybody, I think all other kinds of things got in the way, your regular job and raising kids and, this and that. And so it really didn't kick off until about, I would say about 4 years ago, when I kind of resurrected it and really began then to focus on trying to write some of it and then to find a publisher for it. So I would say about the last 4 or 5
4 years when you really started to decide you want to write the book. And then how long from 4 years ago till now? I know it just got published, so talk about the process there.
Yeah, it actually was finished and was, I believe, if I understood the system at the University of Illinois Press right, was originally scheduled to be published a year ago. But then they brought out this new series of books of which this was going to be a part, and so they deferred it until this year. But leading up to that, there was a lot of actually writing the chapters and then submitting it to the, after the University of Illinois Press said that they would publish it, agree to publish it, submitting the chapters to my editor there, James Engelhardt, a terrific guy who really was very helpful, gave me a lot of great ideas. And those chapters would go in, and James would look at those, and then they would be sent back with some suggestions, which I dutifully followed. And then ultimately, this went out for peer review. And there was, I think, some reactions. You've got too many graveyards and too much morbid stuff in here about tombstones and graveyards. So we decided to pull a couple of chapters that dealt with that kind of stuff. There's still some like that in there. But we pulled those, and I had to write replacements for it. So that slowed it down a little bit. And then, of course, those had to go out for peer review again. And then when they signed off on that and said, yeah, this looks pretty good, but maybe change this a little, that a little bit. And James and I worked through that. And then we pretty much had it ready to go by a year ago this spring.
This may be a dumb question, but I assume that did you go to all the sites?
I did.
And talk about that process of traveling and meeting the people at the different places.
Well, first off, I can say, very fortunately, this happened before COVID, right?
Yeah.
I did all, because all of these places were open. If you go to Cahokia Mounds or you go up to Loudon State Park where the Eternal Indian statue is, those places were open, or Hull House. So, yes, I did travel to each one of those, and I did it for a couple of reasons. One, I think you achieve, for lack of better words, the ambiance of the place if you're there, if you can possibly go. And there are a couple of really once high-regarded historians who are not quite so highly regarded today because they weren't sensitive enough to certain issues at the time, and they were writing quite some time ago. But a guy named Samuel Elliot Morrison was one of them, and he had this, he was a Harvard history professor, and he focused a lot on maritime exploration, and one of the things he did was he did some work on Columbus. He was a Boston Brahmin, so he had a lot of money, and he got some of his buddies, and they got a sailing vessel, and they retraced Columbus's route using the old data and so on. And they did that to sort of experience as close as you could what he had experienced when he made that famous journey. Francis Parkman was another one who was writing in the mid-19th century about the Oregon Trail, and he actually followed the Oregon Trail while the white-topped wagons were on it and all that. so that he could get a better sensing of it. Those two historians are not really highly regarded for various reasons, or as highly regarded for various reasons as they were at one time. But their methodology of actually experiencing what they were writing about, I think, remains valid. And so I sort of adopted that and went to each one of these places to sort of get the feel of it, for lack of better words.
One of the things that I always I'd like to find out is there those interesting tidbits of a couple of places or one place that just stood out that you had no idea you were walking into, and you say, oh, I found this out at, down south or up north, or there's Lincoln and historical places all over the state.
Right.
Any tidbits of information like that?
Yeah, I had been to Cahokia Mounds Historic Site a couple of times before I went for this. But I went again and walked all over the place and everything. But of course, I did a lot of research on it too. And one of the things that emerged from that is that Cahokia has traditionally been in fact, there's been a book on it written called Cahokia City of the Sun. And it has traditionally been viewed as a place where the people who lived there had a relationship with the sun. A lot of the alignment of things there were aligned with sunrises and sunsets at the equinox or whatever.
Yeah.
But recently, and especially with the work of a University of Illinois archaeologist and anthropologist named Tim Pawcatutt, there's been who's done a lot of work with Cahokia. It's emerged that there was a lunar aspect to this as well. And some of the burials, even of some of these people who were interred there, have been buried and lined up at lunar angles. Now, the solar stuff still maintains, I think, on this area called Woodhenge and Monk's Mound, where the sun comes up over Monk's Mound and aligns in a certain way at the equinox with these poles that have been put into this wood pole circle. And that's still there, and that was a part of the Coquins culture. But this lunar phenomenon, and Pawcatutt also found it at other sites, similar sites in this region. Yeah. That was a real discovery for me, that new interpretation has been added onto that. And the air of mystery that hangs over that place. Been a lot of people digging there over the years, their spades and their trowels, and they found a lot, but there's still a lot that's unknown, and it's still a kind of an air of mystery hangs over that place.
And it's still a work in progress, correct?
It is, yeah. There's ongoing research there all the time, and I found that sort of fascinating.
What about any things that you thought were true, but you really now can say that the rumor that's been dispelled, and maybe people actually relearn some history about the great state of Illinois?
Yeah, and I suppose one of those is, and I sort of knew this before, but doing the research on this book confirmed it more or less, and that is the myth, and it's pretty well substantiated now that it's a mythological story, of the tribe of Illinois Indians being driven to the top of Starved Rock, and they were surrounded and couldn't get down and became so desiccated for lack of food and water that they died there. That's pretty much been shown from some research that a guy named Mark Walensky did, that probably is rooted in another story that's sort of similar to that but didn't really happen. But that's one thing that's sort of a thing that we think happened, but it really didn't. Even to the point of giving the place its name.
We are talking to Charles Titus, the author of Exploring the Land of Lincoln, a new book he has out. In this book, also, was there ever a place that you knew you wanted to go to, but it was tough to extract information from either the caretaker or the people or the community, or was everybody forthgiving?
Yeah, I never encountered that.
Okay.
And in fact, I would say it was just the opposite. And then, as you and I were just discussing, I went to every one of these, and I frequently spoke with the person who was in charge of the place. Frequently, these were people with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources or the Illinois Historical Preservation Agency. And they were more than forthcoming to help me, to show me around, to point me to additional places of information. And then in other cases, I also contacted, either by email or with surface mail, people who had been associated with those places in the past, former directors, particularly at the Vandalia State House. The woman who had been the director there, she and I corresponded, and she was very, very forthcoming. So I would say I got a lot of help from those folks.
Speaking of Vandalia, one of the interesting parts of this book was that when they rebuilt it the third time, would anybody want to guess what the cost was? Was it like $16,000 in the mid 1800s to rebuild the courthouse?
Yeah,
or a state house.
Yeah, and that, of course, we'd have to get one of those charts that you can find on the internet to see how much that's worth now. But yeah, and there was a lot of work done to that place, and some of it was done in an effort to keep the capital from moving from Vandalia to Springfield, which it did in 1839, I guess. But it is a fascinating place, and you go in there. It's a beautiful building located in this big green square with a red brick walk leading up to it, and you go in that building. And maybe because I was a history guy, I don't know, but I think other people would sense it too. That building is almost just redolent of history. I mean, you almost feel like you're stepping back there, when Stephen Douglas was there, when Abraham Lincoln was there, when some of these other guys that later became well known were there. So it's a marvelous place to visit.
The other thing that I thought was, I guess, the eerie part of it was when you were writing about the Lincoln Monument or the memorial, is that, people just automatically become quiet and they just let that soak in. Talk about the ambiance, I think the word used, about the Lincoln Memorial in Springfield.
Yeah, that you're absolutely right, Jeff. And I noticed that when I was there. And I've noticed it in other places, too. Not very long ago, I guess a couple of years now, because it's pre-COVID, like anything you've done when you got out of Charleston is pre-COVID. We were in the Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and you go into those rooms where the founding fathers worked, and you've got those green draped tables where they once sat and worked at that, and it's hushed in there. And it's that way in a lot of these places. And I noticed it in the Lincoln tomb. And, of course, the way that place has been curated sort of enhances it, because they have these very subdued lighting. So when you walk in, you immediately are sort of surrounded by this hushed atmosphere, and everybody wants to whisper when they're in there. So, but I've noticed that in other places too.
That was interesting.
But it's certainly true there. And then you go into a sort of an entryway, and then you go from there into a square that goes around it. And as you go around the corridors and end up on the far side, you're there with that very large red monument marking Lincoln's tomb there, and it's very hushed in there. And of course you've got the writing up around the walls, "Now he belongs to the ages," that Stanton was supposed to have said, and everybody's quiet, and I think that's a good thing. It's sort of like a guy by the name of William Manchester. He phrased that when you go into those places, he called that the haze of tribal sentiment. And I think that's what you're experiencing in there, is the haze of tribal sentiment. And it may not be as strong today as it once was, but it's still there.
It's not all about Lincoln, but I want to talk about Lincoln a little bit. Did you find anything out about Lincoln that you didn't know? I mean, you're a history professor, and I guess you're supposed to know everything about Lincoln, but there's all these the stuff comes out. Anything about Lincoln we didn't know?
Well, I won't say that and I certainly am no expert on Lincoln, even though there's been, I don't know 16,000 books written on Lincoln. I don't know what the latest count is. But some things that I did learn, amplified stuff that I had already sort of heard about or knew about. And that was how he was basically, I think, goaded into his famous wrestling match with Jack Armstrong up in New Salem when he was just a young guy. Arrived there in 1832, I guess, 1831. And this guy that he was, a guy named Dennis Offutt, who had given him a job in New Salem at his store. Offutt was going to start a store and was going to let Abe run it.
Yeah.
And apparently Offutt was this sort of gregarious guy, and he says, this guy I'm going to have working for me, he's the best wrestler, and he's the best. And these guys from a place called Clary's Grove, which was a little hamlet near there was a bunch of these, well, I think we do them credit, we call them frontier ruffians.
Yeah.
Oh, well, wait a minute, our guy, Jack Armstrong, he can take anybody around here. And no. And so finally Lincoln was sort of goaded into this. And then, of course, in all the accounts you read about this famous wrestling match, some of them say Lincoln won, some of them say Jack Armstrong won, and some of them say no, it was a draw. But that's the kind of stuff you bump into when you do dig into some of this stuff a little bit more.
A tougher question, if you could ask President Lincoln one question, what would it be?
I would say, Mr. President, you obviously led this country at a very divisive time, so divisive that it broke in two for a period of time. How can you help us be less divisive in our country today? If he could come back and I could sit here and talk with him, how can you help us be less divisive?
That's just a really, really good answer. You went to a lot of historical sites, not all of them had get the whole chapter in your book. There's a little prologue there at the end, an appendix actually, that talks about some of the other places. Yeah. Can you talk about a couple of those other places that stood out, and so we don't leave them out, so we can talk about them just a little bit?
Yeah, the David Davis Mansion in Bloomington, I think, is a pretty impressive place to go architecturally. And it's a good place, I think, to visit. And they do have, and I'm not sure what they're doing now in terms of COVID, but they normally have tours there and volunteers who assist with that, and docents who help with that. That would be a good one to that I think would be fascinating to go to. And then another one would be the Monument to Mother Jones, which I think would be, and I have not gone to that, but from what I read about and the pictures I saw of it, I think that would be a good one to visit, recognizing this woman who was so important in helping miners and that kind of thing. So those are a couple of them that I think would be worthwhile in trying to get to, if you could.
I would be remiss also if I didn't ask you where locally, if someone would like to get the book for Charles Titus's Exploring the Land of Lincoln.
I think it's available from Barnes and Nobles. I think you can order it on Amazon, and you can order it from the University of Illinois Press.
Okay. Will you write another book? Is there a book down in the future, or is this the one that you've been kind of working on because it was one of your dreams to get done?
Well, maybe, yeah, I would like to do something else, and I don't know if there would really be any market for it. What I had in mind essentially was, and it's just a thought process at this point. I haven't gone much farther.
We're not going to put you on the spot that you have to do it. But
I was thinking about a book that would take episodes or events from American history that we all sort of know of, but not really a lot of details about. We may have learned about them in our high school history class, so we can say, well, yeah, I've heard about the sinking of the Maine, but probably I don't know very much more about it.
Like next level?
Yeah, where in that one, for example, I would imagine very few people know that ship was raised in about 1912. Out of the Havana harbor, the crew remains were recovered and interred. Navy took it off the coast of the United States and resunk it, took the masts from it, and I think there's a mast in Annapolis and there's one in at the National Cemetery at Arlington. And we don't really know. There have been about 3 different investigations of the Maine, for example, and there are 3 different versions of why it was sunk. Did the Spanish do it? Did the Cuban insurrectionists do it? Or did something, was it an internal explosion where the coal got too hot because of spontaneous combustion, ignited the powder magazine and blew it up? Really don't know. So to take an incident like that and expand on it and do it, who was Jacob Coxey and what was Coxey's army? How did the rails meet at Promontory, Utah? What happened when James Marshall was walking along the tail race of Sutter's Mill and first saw that gold that triggered the gold rush, that kind of stuff. Now, whether anybody would be interested in that, who knows? And I haven't gotten ambitious enough to do very much with that.
Sounds like those all might be individual books. Actually, if you really wanted to next level. Did anything surprise you on your trek around the state of Illinois at the historical sites? And I want to follow it up with a two-part question: are they all being kept up properly? I mean, the last time you saw, because that always worries me that we don't preserve our history.
Yeah. Yes, to answer your first question, something that surprised me is what I would call a real, well, there are a couple of them, real historical jewels. One is the South Side Community Arts Center at 3831 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago, which is an arts center that focuses on largely on African American art. And it was a product of the Federal Artists Project that came out of the New Deal during the Great Depression. We often think about the WPA and guys out with shovels working, but Roosevelt had programs that put all kinds of other folks to work too, writers, artists, and so on. So the Federal Artists Project was one of the New Deal agencies that was involved in the Southside Community Arts Center. And it's a wonderful place to go to trace the emergence of African American art in Chicago that came about largely, but not entirely, during the Great Migration, when so many African Americans left the Jim Crow South and came to Chicago. And there was a very flourishing art community there on the South Side in the Bronzeville area. And this Southside Community Arts Center captures that. Another, and I was really pretty much unaware of that until I started doing the work on this book. Another one is the Vachel Lindsay home in Springfield, where this
the poet.
Yeah,
I had no idea who that was when I looked at the.
Very, very talented guy who was kind of had a stellar career there for a little while, and his star kind of went into declension, and he ultimately committed suicide. It's a very tragic story, but his home is there in Springfield, and that's been restored, and it's just a gorgeous place to visit. In response to your second question, that varies a little bit. The state of Illinois' budget, as you know, has been kind of under stress. We've experienced that at Eastern and in lots of other places.
That's a nice way to put it, yeah.
And as a result, some things that probably needed to be done, what is the old expression? The can has been kicked down the road on those, and some of those haven't been. A good example of that is the bank in Shawneetown. It's just a beautiful old structure that the state hasn't been able to really do anything with in quite a while, and it needs some work, and there's a few others. But by and large, I think the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and the Illinois Historical Preservation Agency, which is a subdivision of the Department of Natural Resources, I think they've done a good job given the constraints that they faced. So most of these places are not bad, but there are a few that could use some TLC.
As you traveled the state over the years to try to get all the details for this book, Exploring the Land of Lincoln, was there a common thread among Illinoisans, or is the South different from the North, East, West, or as the state, or is there something that really describes Illinoisans?
I didn't really notice that in the process of writing this book, but there is clearly a distinct difference in Illinois culture. Largely a result of its historic antecedents. A lot of southern Illinois was settled by people from the upland South, from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, moving then, many of them, into Indiana and over into Illinois. Lincoln is an example of that, from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois. And those people came from certain sociologists and anthropologists call culture hearths, and they had a certain culture hearth that gave a lot of color and flavor to southern Illinois. But there were other migratory streams that came in from the mid-Atlantic states and from even some from New England, and then immigrant streams that came in and settled the middle and upper parts of the state of Illinois. And those brought their cultural hearth baggage with them as well. So as a result of that, you find a state that has a lot of variety, a lot of diversity in it, going from south to north, which I think contributes to the richness of our state heritage.
We have a couple of minutes left with Charles Titus, whose new book is Exploring the Land of Lincoln. Anybody that you would like to publicly thank, or is there any people out there that really helped with you? I saw Phil Glosser was one of your
Phil Glosser's a great guy, a super talented artist. Traveled with me to some of these sites in the early part of the book, and a number of his illustrations are in it. Phil's a great guy, and want to thank him. A couple of emeritus history professors that I wanted to thank, and that was Dan Hockman, whom I think you know. Yep. I think you and Dan and I were with you once a few years ago talking about Pearl Harbor.
That's right, yes.
Dan read a number of the chapters. Bob Sterling, another emeritus member of the history department, and Jim Quivy, who was chair of English at Eastern, also read a number of the chapters. And of course, my editor, James Engelhardt, and a lot of other people up at the University of Illinois Press have just been really, really wonderful to work with, and I'd like to thank them.
Okay. We're talking the last minute here with Charles Titus. Is there one place that you would just say, hey, you got to go see this to the viewers and listeners out there? Is it the Lincoln Library? Is it Vandalia? Is there someplace people need to see? If you had to pick one?
I would pick, and of course it's probably a personal thing with me, but I would pick Hull House in Chicago. 800 South Halsted Street in Chicago. And that is such an emblem of so many different things. These two young, college-educated women in the fall of 1889 went there, started this settlement house amidst these terrible slums there. And you can go into that place, and it just addresses itself to so many different kinds of things. To go and stand there, go up into her bedroom, go into the room, the drawing room there on the first floor where Jenny Dow had her kindergarten there. It's just a wonderful, wonderful place, and I would encourage people to go there.
I appreciate you coming in today on this Monday, Mr. Charles Titus. His book is Exploring the Land of Lincoln. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jeff. I have enjoyed it.
Thank you. Everybody have a great day. We are WEIU.